Ark the Lad was the second RPG released for the PlayStation, and from what I could gather, the very first tactical RPG of the 5th console generation. At least in Japan, Western Pigus didn't get it till 2002. Releasing only 6 months after the PlayStation's launch, there wasn't an established framework for what a next-gen RPG should look like, which allowed Ark to serve as a bit of a creative endeavour. In a developer interview shot for the English Collection release, they make mention of the inclusion of spoken voice clips during combat, as well as FMVs, which hadn't been possible on pre-existing hardware, at least not to this degree. The creator also confessed to splitting the original concept into 2 separate games, and using the PlayStation's memory card to have events in the former title influence the sequel. I did a cheeky delve into the history of the genre, and I'm fairly confident that Ark was the first console-based tactical RPG to have combat occur on the same screen as movement. I say console-based because King's Bounty came out in 1990 for the PC, and that probably wasn't even the first. Historically, titles such as Fire Emblem and Langrisser featured separate battle scenes when units engaged, allowing for greater detail within the isolated skirmishes. With the PlayStation's looser constraints, the need for battle scenes was lessened, as the field itself could appear far more complex, and the storage granted by CDs allowed for a bigger sprite pool and an opportunity for better animation. Looking at Ark 25 years later, it'd be easy to say that it's a bit generic. However, it's an important piece of history for not only detailing the formative, barren state of the PS1, but also as a weird pit stop on the timeline of console RPGs. Despite releasing only months before Tactics Ogre, a title which redefined the subgenre and whose influence would hold strong through the following decades, Ark contributed very little, as it was trapped in the shadow of its predecessors. Its primary strength lies in its presentation. The tile-based elements have a distinct detail, and sprite animation is so fluid, almost to the point of being overdone. Each character is animated with a calculated personality, which makes it easy to forgive the lackluster story and character arcs, as their body language conveys almost enough to make up for it. Generally, sprite-based PS1 games hold up better than the 3D variant, but the polygonal elements are still pretty good in the few times they're used. Of course, they're all super low res, but there's not much you can do about that. While Ark was ahead of the curve, at least chronologically, it still played it safe by adhering to the top-down perspective of those that came before it. You'll immediately notice the more or less flat appearance when compared to contemporary tactical RPGs, despite the fact that some maps actually have mechanical verticality to them. The height variations themselves largely exist as ledges and cliffs, which characters can interact with, though they don't feature the same significance as those found in the later isometric titles, where unit height was a critical factor. Ark is a simple experience. Character progression is almost entirely relegated to level ups, which due to the short nature of the game are dished out at a sporadic pace. There's no stores or currencies, the game features no equipment system outside of a shallow accessory pool, and alongside expendables, they're required solely from enemies and treasure chests. Each unit can have up to 4 accessories equipped at a time, though most of them offer negligible effects, and there is a quite large selection of negligible effects. The inclusion of more character customization wouldn't make Ark any better. It's not built to be that kind of game, but the progression curve as it stands leaves a lot to be desired, and the requirements for said progression are a mystery. Occasionally, at the beginning of a turn, a character would just level up without having done anything, and I can't explain that. Combat makes up a majority of the gameplay, with some cutscenes sprinkled in for good measure, a fairly standard tactical RPG experience. Where it differs from the norm is that there are a handful of maps you can walk around in, but outside of the odd secret here or there, the movement's clunky as sin, the areas are incredibly restrictive, and NPC dialogue is just that. The world map system doesn't fare much better, as moving between continents forces the same 2-minute long cutscene every time, which discourages going back to areas to search for the aforementioned secrets. However, the maps are colour-coded to great effect. Skyports are blue, battle maps are red, there are other colours, and they signal to the player what to expect before they arrive. It also features an incredibly charming depiction of the party in a state of rest, with idle animations that reflect each of their personalities, and it's a nice addition to the bare-bones nature of map traversal. I also dig the save prompt before entering an area, really brute forcing that safety net for an overly confident player. Definitely saved my ass a few times, as the difficulty can blindside you. Much like every other piece of Ark, combat is simple, and is more or less the standard grid-based tactics experience. It features 7 playable characters, and they're all dispatched during every encounter, with no chance to evaluate their starting position, synergies, or viability. They're a fairly generic bunch. You've got your perfectly balanced anime boy, a healer girl, monk, edgy sword guy, crusty old mage, a kid with a drum, and a happy merchant who summons demons. Yeah, that one's pretty based. It's a passable lineup in a game that otherwise devalues the significance of a roster with its restrictive approach. An interesting addition to field movement is the jump function, which both allies and enemies can use to vault over obstacles, other units, and of course as a means to traverse map elevations. The presence of obstacles occasionally introduces a thought process as to how you'll advance, and while it rarely changes combat to a significant degree, it's used well enough a handful of times. Leapfrogging is also a solid addition, as you're unable to move through other units, which can bottleneck some of the more narrow paths. Jumping over guys helps prioritize the forward motion, and can also be used strategically to undermine enemy positioning. The way jump's used to traverse terrain is useless, as it serves the same function as moving over flat ground, but adds a middleman, which segregates maps a little too much. As there's rarely an alternate path, and few characters have a high jump value, certain maps effectively gate half your forces behind a poorly thought out inclusion. Outside of that, you've got your staples, direction-based attacks, counter-attacks, area of effect magic that's selectively useful, and a desperate game of catch-up as you try to enforce an equitable spread of experience to everyone who isn't your main character. Arc does fare a bit better at this, as the restrictive nature of character progression makes everyone viable, and at least somewhat necessary for the initial push against the hordes of enemies. To further incentivize that, death has no penalty, so you can send allies anywhere with absolutely no consequences. Unless they all die, of course. While it's a relatively short experience, it does feature a few optional goodies, such as a training ground where you fight waves of enemies, a 1000-round tournament where you fight waves of enemies, as well as a 50-floor endgame dungeon where you enslave a child, after fighting through waves of enemies. Tactical RPGs aren't known for their gameplay variants, but piss poor effort, guys. Overall, Arc is one of the most okayest games I've played, and on its own it doesn't offer much. However, it serves as an important vessel for the setup to the sequel. Now, at the time of writing and recording this script, I haven't started Arc the Lad 2, but the way the first title frames the bridge between the two is incredibly effective, even without that follow-through. The game opens with a female being duped into unsealing an ancient demon, after which the perspective shifts to our hero Arc, who is conveniently setting out on a journey to find his missing father and runs into the gullible gal. She returns to the mountain to reseal the demon, so Arc kind of whips it out and is all just like, wait here babe, I'll fix your pipes. And then hard cut to Arc getting brutally slaughtered. As the fiend moves to deal with the girl, Arc is revived by bullshit anime powers and restores the seal, which allows him to continue his journey to mend his daddy issues with his new gal pal in tow. Skip ahead a bit, and after meeting with a king, Arc with a C is instructed to locate the Arc with a K, and now that we've got a proper objective, the rest of the game awkwardly shuffles in around it. Most of the following cutscenes are Arc and company interacting with a bunch of not-so-secretly evil men in positions of power, directly sending them to their demise and cackling about it before they've so much as left the room. It's incredibly cheesy, and I'm not sure if that was the original intent, or if there was a working design behind it. Every turn in the plot is something you see coming a mile away, as ostensibly allied characters neg you in obtrusive ways until it's found out they're either working with the bad guys or are secretly demons themselves. Eventually, your party becomes a ragtag group of 7 heroes who have all been scorned by the demons in some way, and the goal is to find the 5 elemental guardians who will assist in finding the Arc with a K. The story up until the final moments is incredibly generic, however it's precisely because of this generic, mundane narrative that the twist really hits, and why I'm extremely excited to play the sequel. The king, who originally sent Arc on this journey, is murdered by his advisor, and the blame is laid on our protagonist. This facilitates a complete capture of the kingdom, and possibly the entire world. The power dynamics are never really established, but everyone's on high alert and martial law has been enacted, with the heroes wanted for regicide. This comes to a head as the parties miss seconds from completing their journey to obtain this fabled power, as the advisor and his cronies arrive to capture both Arc and the Arc. The parties march to their deaths at the barrel of 3 men, despite being vicious paranormal demon slayers only moments prior. As the heroes reach the final moment of their collective journey, the ground splits, conveniently removing the guards from play, as the female gets separated from the rest of the party and they just kind of fuck off in an airship. Arc the Lad ends with the main party divided, declared fugitives for allegedly killing a king with a military state enacted to capture them, the Arc stolen, and the Demon Lord on the verge of waking up. Shit's fucked, and then the credits roll. The game's only about 8 hours long, with a few hours added for optional content, and it definitely feels like a cop-out to split a single narrative over 2 purchases, but what a way to hype your sequel, and in such a blinding contrast to the safe plotting of earlier events. I sincerely hope the sequel can carry the momentum picked up at the end of the game, and that it introduces the required elements to make it a standout title, as opposed to a short, fairly forgettable romp. While Ark did attempt some neat shit, and it should be respected for the time period it released, it's too simple to sink your teeth into, and it's only really worth playing to set up the sequel, which is a shame because there's a lot of potential here. With Tactics Ogre releasing shortly after it, and Final Fantasy Tactics only a few years after that, the bar was set incredibly high for what a tactical RPG should offer, and unfortunately, Ark just doesn't meet those expectations. It seems like more time was spent on these superficial increments that come with new hardware instead of challenging the fundamentals and crafting a standout experience. If more foundational work was afforded to this bizarre title, Ark could have been a game that effectively dictated the following decades of tactics RPGs, and while I'm glad that it wasn't such a significant driving force due to the state it ultimately ended up in, the universe where Ark was Tactics Daddy would have been an interesting one, to say the least. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll stick around for 5 more years so I can finish the series.